What is better for an artist, to be loved or feared?
Well, loved, I think. America's such a big entity, not just as a physical place, but as a concept. Which America are we talking about? Probably the only thing artists should never do is to be boring. Although even that, I mean, you can think of lots of kind of boring artworks, but
I chatted to our mutual friend Rosalie Goldberg, who told me she visited your studio after you had graduated from CalArts, and she found the most radical thing she could imagine, which is that you were painting. Did it feel radical at the time?
I have to say it did. There was something, I wouldn't say illicit about it, but something that's slightly transgressional about returning to painting. I had been a painter before going to CalArts. I went to CalArts as a painter. I spent the first year painting. So it wasn't something that I discovered sort of as a fluke. It was a return to something that was part of my identity. But for sure, in the mid and late 70s, there was I don't know if it was consensus exactly, but there was an attitude that painting belonged to a historically bounded time frame, and that to go forward required some other form. It just turned out not to be true. It turned out to be a kind of momentary conceit. But we did have to break through that fourth wall, so to speak.
It's so interesting because we were just chatting about the 80s, the 90s, and in that era, in the 80s, things were moving so fast.
Cultural things move at different speeds at different times, and they're always related to the larger world, the larger economic forces. What happened in the art world specifically in the 70s, there had been a terrible recession in the US, and I think in 74. And the trickle-down effect of that was to really freeze the art world, the gallery system, part of the art world. That's not the entire art world, but that New York gallery aspect was terribly locked in place. At that moment, there was very little opportunity. The attitude was, oh, you're a young person? Oh, that's nice. Call us in 10 years. No one cared. And in a way, it was brutal. Another way, it was quite generative, because you were kind of thrown back on yourself. As always, the shifts were tied to shifts in the general economic picture. In the beginning of the 80s, there was an unleashing of economic forces that meant that people of a certain generation were looking at art again. And that created opportunity for people of my generation. So that was just the luck of timing.
And in that moment of Reaganomics, 34 having such a prominent exhibition at the Whitney at such a young age, did the recognition change you?
I don't think so. People say this all the time, but I think there's certainly an element of truth to it. You are who you are. I mean, at that point, I was 34, 35. My identity as an artist, although certainly not fixed, at least hopefully not fixed, it wasn't like a reed in the wind. So I was kind of too busy to be that affected by it in that external way.
I would love to pick up where we left off in your studio in Brooklyn. And you told me at the time about when you first arrived here in Los Angeles. And if I may, I'd love to hear about that hero's journey to the inaugural class of CalArts. What did you find in Santa Clarita?
You know, it's true. I hadn't been anywhere at that age. I think I was 17. I hadn't traveled anywhere. Hadn't been in actually a real city before. The marvel of walking out of LAX into the warm afternoon with palm trees all around was quite a revelation. What I had expected from the school was a great deal of freedom and also rigor. But I didn't really know. No one knew what to expect. But that all turned out to be true. I felt it was a tremendous sense of trust on the part of the faculty. The assumption was that everyone who was there was already an artist, even if it wasn't really true, that was the fiction was maintained. But the flip side of that, there was a tremendous amount of expectation to actually do something. There were so many people there the first couple of years. Paul Brock was the dean of the art school, who, I mean, he's not remembered today for his painting, but he was an incredible raconteur. He was referred to as the golden throat. He could talk about anything at length. Paul was the dean. Alan Capro would be the associate dean. John, of course, was there. Of course, John Baldessari was there.
And of course, you knew how to drive, which was a very essential skill, it seems. What did that mean for you in terms of time spent with Vito Acconci and Germano Celant? Any interesting conversations or collaborations?
My scholarship was dependent on a certain amount of work, a certain number of hours, work-study job, and that job was to drive people around, because I had a car. Not everyone did. So it was my job to meet people at the airport, and in the case of Germano Celant, to drive him for weeks, seemingly endlessly, always in search of the perfect espresso coffee. I had a lot of fun with Vito. So I was the all-around gopher chauffeur for a lot of these people.
I love that. We have Ravi Rajan and some colleagues in the audience, and they were saying at CalArts today, our goal is really to keep it weird, to make sure that we are continuing to bring in thinkers and makers who are contributing to the conversation. I'd love to invoke one of those incredible thinkers, and John Baldessari, of course, was such an important ally and friend. And I remember in 2010, you published a set of questions that you had asked him in the Paris Review, and I wonder if you might indulge me in a quick fire round if I just ask you a couple of favors.
We could try.
All right. What is better for an artist, to be loved or feared?
Well, loved, I think.
What is the most tenacious misconception about your work?
Oh, about my work? Oh, well, I think this is a long conversation, but I think it's the notion of appropriation, which is one of those, an idea that was useful when it was useful, and then it became encoded in the academic discourse, and now it's such a misdirection of what is actually the case. I would just, like, that word should be retired.
In what way is your work American? And as you think about that, as we look to the Venice Biennale, do you have any sense of nationalism in art at all?
I mean, in the most expansive sense, I think we like to feel like nationality plays no role in art. Art transcends nationality. But of course, that's ridiculous, that one is always product of one's culture. Cultures are different. So I do feel American, although it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the hell is so American about what I do. Because America's such a big entity, not just as a physical place, but as a concept. Which America are we talking about? Maybe 20 years ago or 50 years ago, a certain kind of optimism was American. When you look at a protractor painting by Frank Stella from 1966 or whenever it was, that feels American. That's an embodiment of American optimism. But also, if you look at a Paul Thek sculpture, it's an embodiment of American pessimism. So which one's the American? I don't know. There's an American sense of using the past without being beholden to it, without being overshadowed by it. But I feel like I'm not really the one to answer that question. Someone else can do it.
And finally, what's the one thing an artist must never do?
Well, I think the minute you start prescribing something with confidence that this is really correct, of course you're going to be contradicted, because you're going to find someone who does exactly that thing. Probably the only thing artists should never do is be boring. Although even that, I mean, you can think of lots of kind of boring artworks, but in a good sense.
One of those people who was a great fan of your work, Hans Ulrich Obrist, said you are a real Renaissance man.
I think what he's talking about is very early on, I was always enamored of contemporary dance, contemporary ballet. even when I was a kid. And there was already in the 50s and 60s a tradition of painters making sets and costumes for choreographers. So Merce Cunningham famously collaborated with all the important artists of the day, notably Johnson Rauschenberg, but not only, many others. And Alex Katz had already, by the early 60s, designed numerous ballets for Paul Taylor, some of which I saw when I was growing up. So this was a living tradition within the kind of painting world. It wasn't that big of a leap. So when I met Carol Armitage, the choreographer, when she asked me to do something for a ballet she'd commissioned by Baryshnikov to make for ABT at the Metropolitan Opera, it was, on the one hand, very daunting because of the scale of it. On the other hand, it was very much within this tradition that I understood in the art world.
It's very Diaghilev, in a sense, in terms of the ballet.
Well, I guess you could say it starts there. It starts with Diaghilev and Leon Bakst and the people in that era. But it really was reinvented in the 60s with Merce and later with Paul Taylor. I felt about Carol's work some absolute synchronicity with what I was trying to do, the non-classical classicism, or the classical liberalism of it. The thing about dance, or anything that unfolds on a stage, it has the element of time, which is the one aspect that painting doesn't have. So the ability to create images that unfolded over time on a stage with continually moving components was just very exciting.
This leads me to your collaboration with Scorsese. So, of course, the film Search and Destroy has become such a cult film. Can you tell us what drove you behind the camera?
Yeah, I think Search and Destroy, unlikely enough, was voted some film society's favorite film in Croatia a number of years ago. But it was seen by a few people in this country. The film was a natural extension of having worked with Carol and worked with dancers and singers on stage. Once you've had that experience of shaping the imagistic meaning of things over time, it was a kind of natural jump to film. I had always been interested in narrative and language. I was invested in that. So it's something I wanted to see if I could make something that was imagistically lively, but also told the story.
And of course, the writing, How to See, is such an iconic book. I'm sure everyone in this audience has read it and thumbed it and taken the notes. And Salman Rushdie even said that this was our era's response to John Berger's ways of saying.
Yeah, I believe Salman said that. That was such a wonderful quote. Yeah, the book, hopefully people are still reading it. It's meant to be very approachable and hopefully will provide a model for how to talk about art in a non-technical way, because the conversation around art, or the writing around art, had become so highly theoretical. It was daunting for people, and unnecessarily so.
It's such a beautiful collection of essays. And of course, you also write for the New York Review of Books. What do you think the state of art criticism is at the moment?
It's challenging. I think the way art history is taught, not that I would necessarily know, I've been in school for decades, but from what I can tell, it still has, there's not a tremendous trust of one's own sensations, so that things have to be grounded in a theoretical framework to be taken seriously. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's a funny starting point. What I was trying to do in that book, what I continue to try to do, and what I encourage other people to do, is just ask yourself, was that what I really think about it? I know what I'm supposed to be thinking, but is that what I'm really thinking when I look at that? And often the answer is something quite different from what it's supposedly about.
We'll turn to 2023 and the explosive article in the New York Times where you told Zachary Small that you had worked with engineers to train AI on artist work, including your own work, the pastorals, to create the new pastorals. And the question I had is whether you could take us to the first image the machine gave you that actually made you think, okay, there's something really interesting here. When was that, and what did you do next?
I was working with a company to develop a game that you could play on your phone that would enable people to experience the thrill of making juxtapositions, like imagistic comparisons and juxtapositions. We never ended up making a game, but in the process of doing that, I was exposed to AI as a capability. And everything that I saw produced in that way, I thought was missing some essential ingredient on the purely visual relationship to visual art. It'd be interesting, arresting, weird, provocative, but nothing felt like art to me. So I really started the whole AI process by trying to figure out what was missing in the recipe. So I started to learn how the thing functioned, how it was made, how it was programmed.
And you had a collaborator with you. You had an engineer by your side?
Yeah, of course. I wouldn't even know how to turn the machine on without the engineer sitting next to me, nor would I care to know. But with his help, we just tried to diagnose what's missing from this thing. And it was very, very, very simple. It had been invented and programmed by engineers that have no interest in the visual arts whatsoever. So how would they possibly know what to teach it? When I realized that it just simply didn't have the right schooling, we just created a curriculum for it. It turned out to be a very apt and willing student. Having done that, the next step was to tailor the curriculum even in an even more specific way to create something that I might like or I might want to use or work with. That's when we started isolating examples from history of art.
Is that where De Chirico, Hopper, Dove started to come in?
Everything to illustrate a certain element. This one for value pattern, and that one for edges, that one for compositional rhythm. We started to get results that were interesting and compelling. It just kept going. We kept tailoring it, making it narrower and narrower selection. And then finally we threw all that away and trained it only on aspects of my own work from the past, elements that I thought would rhyme with the machine's ability to scan and distinguish similarity and difference, which is really what it does.
And at the time when we met, you said that for you, AI was just like a palette knife. And of course, great artists have always harnessed technologies.
I mean, palette knives maybe a little bit glib. The point is, it's a tool. And I do hear the echo of John's voice saying, when video was new, people wondered if it could really be art. And it sounds odd today, but there were people in the early 70s who just thought this is categorically not art because it's entertainment or it's whatever. And John said, well, it's a tool. You can use it for however you want to. It's a pencil. You can make something great out of it. Make something stupid out of it. That part's up to you. So I do feel like this is a tool, and it really depends upon one's intention.
To finish the cycle with John Baldessari and AI, I believe there was a moment where he mentioned that if art is meaningful at all, it's in conversation with other artists. You say something, they say something. And who are you in dialogue with right now? Or what are you chasing in your studio that you might not have been 10 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that what I'm doing now is fundamentally or categorically different from what I've always done. But I do think that as artists, we're always kind of upping the ante. I'm trying to bring into alignment a greater array of ideas, forces, images that maybe function at a higher imagistic frequency than things I might have done 10 years ago. I feel like it's always it sounds so self-aggrandizing or melodramatic, but it's always a kind of tightrope walk. And I just feel like the tightrope just gets higher and tighter, and you keep walking it.
I would love to move to the extreme present It's extraordinary to believe that it's your first solo show in Los Angeles in 30 years. Of course, it opened at Spruthmoggers, and that is one of the trifecta of your galleries, I believe, alongside Lehman Maupin and Tadeusz Ropacz. My Frankenstein is quite a loaded title. Can you tell us more about that?
There is this sense, we talked about it already, there's a sense that AI is going to wreak havoc on society, and which it very well may. I don't really have any thoughts about that. But in the visual arts, the idea that it's going to replace artists or take over the art world or substitute its intention for human intention, I personally find nonsensical. It might happen at some point in the future, but not anytime soon. So the fear around it, to me, is very misplaced. The image of Frankenstein, of course, it's actually a misnomer. Frankenstein was the name of the scientist, not the name of the monster. But in the popular imagination, we've sort of transposed the name onto the monster itself.
Creator goes too far.
The creator goes too far, but also that we created a monster, a Frankenstein monster. Now it's going to ruin everything. I just don't believe that. So I can invoke the name in a tongue-in-cheek, ironic way, clearly meaning the opposite.
So there's nothing that you've seen that scares you?
Well, let's put it this way. Bad art scares me.
Bad art, boring art.
Yeah, right.
Those sound terrifying.
Yeah.
Terrifying, especially being here in these hallowed halls at LACMA. And of course, you have so long been in the collections of LACMA and the Broad and MoCA. And I wonder, here, 2026, do you think still that institutional recognition continues to be an ultimate ambition for artists?
I think it has always been important, and it continues to be. If you read letters and diaries of artists from the early 20th century or late 20th century, the struggle for institutional acceptance is a constant concern. I don't see it changing, even as our institutions themselves change and our relationship to them changes. The kind of reifying codification aspect that they have with art is still very important, for better or for worse.
How did it feel coming back? It's extraordinary to think 30 years since the solo exhibition, and I believe several since you've actually been in California.
Well, 30 years goes by surprisingly fast.
If you're not being boring or making bad art, clearly.
It doesn't seem like so long ago, really, but I know it is. I do think that this actually illustrates a point, that there is something in the nature of making art, even though so many things around it change, the support system changes, the materials change, the audience changes. There's something about the making art itself which doesn't change. It's different for each individual, of course, but the nature of the endeavor stays constant. So that's my measure of reality.
It's so wonderful, and maybe as we near the end of this conversation, this Proustian, the idea of advice to a young artist. And I think you have said in the past, be patient, be brave, be lucky. After everything we've talked about, I wanted to ask, would you extend that advice, or is that...
Any other advice? Be lucky.
Be patient, be brave, be lucky.
There was, I actually wasn't my class. It was after I left, but I think maybe the next, or the one after, graduating class at CalArts, the commencement speaker was Roy Lichtenstein, who later became a good friend of mine. Roy's commencement address consisted of, have all the luck in the world. In a way that hasn't changed very much.
I guess I'll be cheeky and then ask you, as we embark on the Chanel Center for Artists and Technology, if you had advice for a facilitator of such an endeavor, and if you were reinventing CalArts for 2026, what would you build and what would you ban?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, because and this was the genius of the school, but it didn't ban anything that wasn't violent. So things that were clearly questionable or not going to lead anywhere. They still weren't banned. Everything was encouraged. And I think at times I felt, well, people are really wasting their time. But all that was necessary, that the non-banningness of things was necessary. Very daunting for people to be confronted with that much freedom and that little structure. A lot of people were not up to it. But I still think it's the best way.
I hope Ravi Rajan is listening. We have the director in the audience, and this is wise words from an extraordinary artist. David, it has been such a pleasure being here in conversation with you here in Los Angeles. It's such a special week. Of course, it's a city that has been through so much this past year that keeps showing us what resilience, community, and creativity look like. And above all else, thank you, David Salle.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you for coming here.